The first sound I noticed was the soft scrape of chairs against the courtroom floor, the nervous kind of movement people make when they think the outcome has already been decided, and all that's left is formality. Papers rustled. A throat cleared. Then my husband walked in. He didn't look at me. Not really. He walked with the ease of someone arriving late to a meeting he already believed he'd won, his hand brushing the small of the woman beside him as if she belonged there. She sat close to him, close enough that their knees nearly touched, close enough that everyone could see she wasn't hiding. He leaned toward her just slightly, the way people do when they think their words won't travel. "She's nothing," he whispered. She smiled without hesitation. Exactly. They didn't lower their voices enough to be discreet. They lowered them just enough to be cruel. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me. I didn't blink. I didn't straighten my posture or tighten my jaw or give them the reaction they were clearly waiting for. My hands rested calmly in my lap, fingers loosely folded, as if I were listening to something unimportant. Around us, the room responded before I did. A few heads turned. Someone exhaled sharply behind me. My lawyer shifted in her chair, her pen hovering above her notebook, as if she might tap my arm and urge me to speak. No one said a word, but the conclusion settled quickly and quietly. I had already lost. That was the decision everyone made in those first few minutes. That I was finished, that I was invisible, that whatever this hearing was meant to resolve, it would not be resolved in my favor. They were wrong about one thing, though they wouldn't realize it for a while. I was silent on purpose. The courtroom itself was unremarkable, the kind of space designed to drain emotion from the air. Neutral walls, rows of benches polished smooth by years of waiting bodies. A raised bench at the front where authority sat quietly, unmoved by anyone's confidence or despair. This room had seen endings before, and it would see many more after us. My husband sat tall, shoulders relaxed, one arm draped casually along the back of his chair. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head, and liked the way it ended. The woman beside him mirrored his certainty. Her posture was easy, her expression composed, her presence deliberate. She did not glance at me once. The judge entered without ceremony, taking her seat with practiced calm. She glanced down at the file in front of her, then at the attorneys on either side, and finally out across the room. Her face gave nothing away. It never did. My lawyer leaned closer to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you want to say something," she murmured, "this would be the time." I nodded slightly to show I'd heard her. I didn't answer. I could feel the assumptions forming, stacking neatly on top of one another. That I was overwhelmed, that I was tired, that I wanted this over. Silence has a way of inviting interpretation, and people are rarely generous with it. Across the room, my husband glanced at me for the first time, his eyes flicking over my face as if checking whether I'd finally understood my place. When I didn't meet his gaze, he smiled to himself and turned back to his lawyer. The woman beside him leaned in closer, her confidence sharpened by my lack of response. They believed my quiet meant consent. They believed it meant weakness. What they couldn't see was how familiar this moment felt to me. How many times I had sat in rooms just like this one, listening while decisions were made about my life as if I were an afterthought. How often my presence had been tolerated rather than respected. The judge began with procedural remarks, her tone even and measured. Agreements had been submitted, documents reviewed. The words floated through the room without weight, landing wherever they pleased. My husband listened with half an ear, nodding at intervals, already thinking past this moment to whatever came next. I listened to everything. When the judge paused to read more carefully, the room shifted again. The silence stretched longer than before, just long enough to feel intentional. I noticed the change before anyone else did, the way her eyes lingered on the page instead of moving on, the way her fingers stopped turning paper. Then she looked up. Not at me, not yet. Her gaze settled directly on my husband and the woman beside him, steady and unblinking. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something it couldn't quite name. My husband straightened slightly, his confidence flickering but not breaking. He still believed this was a formality, a brief pause before confirmation. The woman beside him tilted her head, her smile tightening at the edges. The judge didn't speak right away. She let the silence do its work. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was the last time they would feel untouchable, the last moment when my absence of sound could be mistaken for absence of presence. I stayed exactly where I was, my hands still folded, my eyes steady. I said nothing. And for the first time since they had walked into that room together, the certainty they carried began to hesitate. I stayed seated as the judge reviewed the file, the silence pressing gently against my ears, and I realized how familiar that feeling was. Not the courtroom itself, but the sensation of waiting while others decided who I was and what I deserved. It wasn't new, it hadn't started here. For most of my marriage, I had been useful long before I was valued. In the early years, there had been excitement, the kind that comes with believing you're building something together. We were young then, still speaking in plans and promises, still saying "we" without hesitation. When his ambitions grew larger than our shared life, I adjusted without complaint. I moved my schedule. I took on more responsibility at home. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. It felt like partnership at the time. It took years to recognize it as training. My role settled quietly into place. I managed details no one else wanted to see: calendars, finances, introductions, apologies. I remembered birthdays and smoothed over conflicts. I was the person who made sure everything worked so he could appear effortless. When people complimented his success, he smiled and accepted it. When they asked how he did it, he never mentioned me. At first, the omissions felt accidental. Then they became routine. At dinners, I was introduced last, if at all. Conversations flowed around me like I wasn't sitting there, my presence acknowledged only when it was inconvenient to ignore. His family spoke over me with practiced ease, deciding holidays and plans as if my opinion would only complicate things. When I tried to contribute, I was met with polite nods that changed nothing. The small humiliations were the easiest to dismiss. A joke at my expense framed as teasing, a correction in public, disguised as concern. Each one minor enough to forgive, but together they formed a pattern. I learned that silence kept the peace. I learned that speaking up made me the problem. I told myself it was temporary. That effort would eventually be seen. That being agreeable was an investment. What I didn't realize was how easily invisibility becomes expectation. Over time, my contributions became assumed rather than appreciated. Decisions that affected both of us were presented to me as conclusions instead of conversations. When I expressed hesitation, it was treated as resistance. When I asked questions, I was told not to worry about things I didn't understand. I began to shrink without noticing. I chose words more carefully. I spoke less often. I deferred even when I disagreed. It wasn't fear that guided me, but the belief that harmony mattered more than acknowledgement. I didn't see how that belief was being used against me. The shift from disregard to contempt was subtle but unmistakable once it arrived. He interrupted me openly. He corrected me in front of others without apology. When I disagreed, he smiled the way people do when they think someone is being unreasonable and moved on as if the conversation were over. And it was. By the time the woman who would later sit beside him in court appeared in our lives, the groundwork had already been laid. I had spent years teaching the people around us that my silence was consent, that my patience meant compliance. They had learned to look through me because I had made it easy. I didn't recognize the damage immediately. I was too focused on keeping things stable, on preserving the image of a marriage that worked. I believed that loyalty would be rewarded, that consistency would eventually restore balance. Instead, it erased me further. Back in the courtroom, his whisper echoed in my memory, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. "She's nothing." It wasn't the first time I'd been reduced to that, only the first time it had been said aloud. The woman beside him smiled with the confidence of someone who believed she had replaced me. What she didn't understand was that there had been very little left to replace. As the judge continued reading, I felt no shock, no sting, only recognition. This was where years of being overlooked had led. This was the natural outcome of a long education in being underestimated. I glanced down at my hands, steady in my lap, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. They believed I was nothing because I had allowed them to believe it. Because I had chosen silence when explanation felt exhausting. Because I had prioritized peace over presence. But silence, I had learned, teaches people what they can get away with. The courtroom hummed softly with restrained impatience. My husband shifted in his chair, still comfortable, still certain. The woman beside him leaned closer, her confidence unchallenged. My lawyer watched me carefully, uncertainty flickering behind her professional calm. No one in that room questioned why I wasn't speaking. They thought they already knew. What they didn't understand was that being underestimated had given me something I'd never had before. Freedom from expectation, space to observe, time to choose when to speak. I lifted my eyes as the judge turned another page, my expression unchanged. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt prepared. They had spent 15 years learning to see me as nothing. They had no idea what that belief was about to cost them. She sat beside him in the courtroom as if she had always belonged there, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, her presence unquestioned. She didn't fidget or glance around the room. She didn't scan faces or adjust her clothes. She sat like someone attending a meeting she had helped plan, not a hearing that might unravel her life. I noticed how close she leaned toward him, how naturally her shoulder angled in his direction, how little space existed between them. There was an intimacy there that went beyond an affair. It was confidence, possession. She believed she was the future being discussed, not an accessory to the past. She didn't look at me once. That, more than anything else, told me what she thought of me. A detail about her pulled me backward without warning. The scent of her perfume, faint but deliberate, stirred a memory I hadn't visited in a long time. I was standing in a restaurant, a place we had frequented together, still wearing the title of wife, even as it began to slip from my hands. He had arrived late that evening, already distracted, already distant. When she appeared beside him, I recognized her before he spoke her name. Not because I had seen her before, but because she stood too close, because she touched his arm as if it were familiar territory, because she smiled at him like someone who believed she had earned that right. He introduced her casually, as if she were a colleague, a friend, an afterthought. She met my eyes briefly, her expression polite but unreadable. There was no apology in it, no discomfort, only curiosity, as if she were assessing something outdated. That was the first moment I understood I was being replaced, not hidden. After that, she began to appear more often, at events where I had always stood beside him, in conversations that once included me. She didn't hover at the edges or wait for permission. She stepped into spaces that had been mine and occupied them fully. She spoke for him sometimes, answering questions before he could. She referenced plans I hadn't heard about, decisions I hadn't been part of. When I corrected her once, gently, she smiled and let him respond instead. He didn't contradict her. He didn't look at me. The message was clear. I was no longer the authority on my own life. The humiliations grew bolder as my silence continued. Introductions became more awkward, then non-existent. People spoke over me as if I were invisible, their eyes sliding past mine to rest on her. When I excused myself from conversations, no one noticed. When I stayed, no one adjusted. She learned quickly what my silence meant, that I wouldn't cause a scene, that I wouldn't make things uncomfortable, that I would endure. Her confidence didn't come from cruelty, it came from certainty. She believed she understood the situation. She believed she had been chosen because she was better, newer, more valuable. She didn't see herself as an interloper, she saw herself as an upgrade. And my husband encouraged that belief. He grew more relaxed as she grew bolder. He stopped monitoring his words around me. He let her speak freely, even when it bordered on dismissive. When she laughed at something I said, he didn't correct her. When she excluded me, he didn't intervene. I watched it all without comment, my restraint misread as acceptance. People assumed I had come to terms with it, that I had been compensated in some unspoken way. They told me how strong I was, how understanding. They praised my composure without realizing how easily composure can be mistaken for consent. What no one asked was why she seemed so sure of herself. She spoke about the future as if it were already written, about where they would live, about plans he and I had once made together, about transitions that hadn't yet occurred. She wasn't guessing, she was repeating. That was when I began to understand that her confidence was borrowed. Back in the courtroom, she crossed her legs and leaned closer to him as the judge spoke, her attention fixed on his reactions rather than the proceedings. She was watching for reassurance, for confirmation that everything was unfolding as expected. She still didn't look at me. To her, I was irrelevant, a formality, someone whose presence was required but whose participation was unnecessary. I studied her face in profile, the calm set of her mouth, the slight curve of satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. She had no reason to be careful, no reason to doubt. She believed the story she had been given, and stories are comforting when you don't question their structure. What she didn't know was how often confidence leads people to expose themselves, how quickly certainty turns into carelessness, how dangerous it is to assume you understand a situation when you've only been handed the summary. She never learned who I was because she never needed to. She never asked because she never thought it mattered. The judge paused, her eyes lifting briefly before returning to the documents. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. I felt it before I saw it, a change in temperature, a subtle tightening of the air. The woman beside my husband adjusted in her seat, just slightly. Not enough to draw attention, enough to show she felt something move. She still didn't look at me. And that was her mistake. She believed she had replaced me. She believed I was the past, already resolved, already dismissed. She had no idea that everything she trusted rested on the same assumption my husband had made years ago. That I was nothing. She never learned the cost of believing that, because by the time she understood it, there would be nothing left for her to do but watch. The judge began outlining procedural details, her voice steady and unemotional, and I felt my lawyer shift closer to me. I could sense her hesitation before she spoke, the careful way she lowered her voice as if afraid of being overheard. "If you want to respond," she whispered, "this is the moment." I didn't look at her. I didn't nod or shake my head. I simply remained still, my gaze fixed on the smooth surface of the table in front of me. My silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. It was a decision I had already made long before we entered this room. The old version of me would have spoken. She would have clarified, corrected, explained. She would have tried to sound reasonable, to soften the edges of the truth so no one felt uncomfortable. She would have believed that if she just chose the right words, fairness would follow. That version of me thought being heard was the same as being understood. She was wrong. Every time I had explained myself in the past, it had only given him more material to dismiss. Every justification became a weakness. Every attempt to be reasonable was treated as emotional instability. I had learned, slowly and painfully, that speaking too early never protected me. It protected him. So I stayed quiet. Across the room, my husband glanced at me again, this time with mild irritation. He expected interruption. He expected resistance. My lack of reaction unsettled him just enough to draw his attention, but not enough to alarm him. He leaned back in his chair, assuming my silence meant resignation. The woman beside him waited for me to react, her eyes flicking toward me briefly before returning to his face. When I didn't give her what she wanted, her confidence sharpened. She mistook restraint for retreat. Silence has a way of changing the atmosphere in a room. People are uncomfortable when the expected script doesn't unfold. They begin to fill the gaps themselves, projecting meaning where none is offered. In that space, assumptions grow quickly. I could feel them forming around me. That I was tired. That I wanted this over. That I didn't have the resources or the strength to fight. Even my lawyer worried, though she tried not to show it. Her concern wasn't doubt in my intelligence. It was fear that I was sacrificing too much by saying nothing. She didn't know what I knew. The more I stayed quiet, the more freely my husband spoke. He explained things casually, confident that no one was challenging his narrative. He corrected minor details without care, no longer cautious about consistency. He spoke as if the outcome was inevitable, as if the process itself were an inconvenience rather than a safeguard. I watched carefully, noticing how his confidence loosened his discipline, how certainty made him careless. There was a brief recess, just long enough for people to stand and stretch, for whispered conversations to ripple through the room. Someone near us suggested I should assert myself, that judges respected women who stood their ground. I listened politely and offered no response. Everyone wanted me to react, no one expected me to wait. Waiting, I had learned, was powerful. When proceedings resumed, the dynamic had shifted slightly. My husband spoke more than necessary, elaborating on points that didn't require explanation. His lawyer, sensing the change, attempted to steer him back toward restraint, but he waved it off with an impatient gesture. He didn't feel threatened. He felt untouchable. The woman beside him mirrored his confidence, nodding along, her expression one of quiet triumph. She had stopped watching me entirely. In her mind, I was already resolved, already dismissed. That was when I understood how deeply the illusion had taken hold. No one guards information from someone they believe is irrelevant. No one filters their words around someone they think has already lost. Being written off is a kind of invisibility that opens doors you didn't know existed. I sat there and let them talk. Let them assume. Let them believe my silence was empty. In truth, silence gave me time. Time to listen. Time to observe. Time to let them reveal exactly how secure they felt. It removed the pressure to perform, to convince, to defend. It positioned me outside the noise, where clarity lives. When the judge asked a routine question and my husband answered too quickly, I noted it. When his lawyer hesitated before following his lead, I noted that too. Each small misstep mattered. Each assumption stacked quietly on the next. By the time the session ended for the day, the story they believed about me had fully formed. I was the woman who had given up, the woman who accepted what she was given, the woman who would walk away quietly. They believed I had nothing left to claim. As I gathered my things and stood to leave, my husband didn't look at me. He was already talking about what came next, already planning beyond this moment. The woman beside him laughed softly, her relief evident, her future seemingly secure. I walked out without a word. Silence followed me down the hallway, not as absence, but as intention. Every step reinforced the truth I had come to understand too late to regret. Silence isn't weakness, it's positioning. And the longer they mistook it for surrender, the more exposed they became to what was waiting for them. My husband spoke easily that morning, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who believed every risk had already been managed. He joked with his lawyer while papers were arranged, leaning back in his chair as if the hearing were a formality he was politely enduring. The woman beside him smiled at the right moments, her posture relaxed, her certainty absolute. I watched him and felt a strange sense of distance, like observing a familiar scene after you've learned how it ends. I had seen this version of him before. This was how he looked right before he overlooked something important. A phrase he used as he spoke to his attorney tugged at my memory, sharp and unexpected. It was something he'd said years earlier, casually, without thinking, during a time when everything appeared stable. Back then, I hadn't questioned it. I trusted him. I trusted the image he presented to the world. That trust had cracked quietly, long before this courtroom ever existed. It began with something so small it almost embarrassed me to notice it. A number that didn't align. A timeline that didn't quite fit. At first I assumed I'd made a mistake. I rechecked the information, then checked it again, annoyed with myself for being distracted. The inconsistency remained. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone misfiles things sometimes. Everyone misremembers details. But then I saw it again, in a different place, attached to a different decision. The same pattern, faint but unmistakable. A discrepancy that shouldn't have existed if everything were as solid as it appeared. I didn't confront him, not then. I knew him too well to believe confrontation would lead to clarity. Questions would turn into accusations. Curiosity would be reframed as doubt in his abilities. If I pushed too hard, he would close ranks, tighten control, and the window I was barely aware of would slam shut. So I stayed quiet and watched. As time passed, the image he projected grew larger, shinier. Public praise increased. Compliments flowed. People spoke about his success as if it were effortless, inevitable. He basked in it, confident that admiration was proof enough of stability. Privately, I began to notice what others didn't. How often he avoided specifics. How quickly he redirected conversations that drifted toward verification. How irritated he became when anyone suggested reviewing details more closely. His certainty depended on no one looking too carefully, including me. I began to understand that his confidence wasn't built on transparency, it was built on assumption. The woman who would later take my place confirmed that without realizing it. Once, in passing, she mentioned a plan that didn't exist. She spoke about it with ease, as if it were already settled, repeating something she had clearly been told. The detail was wrong, not dramatically so, but enough to catch my attention. She didn't know it was wrong. She didn't question it. She believed what she had been given and carried it forward without understanding its weight. That was when I knew more than one person was relying on the same incomplete story. Back in the courtroom, my husband waved dismissively when a document was referenced, his confidence bordering on impatience. He didn't bother to look at it, trusting that whatever mattered would have been highlighted for him. His lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, a subtle pause no one else seemed to notice. I noticed. That hesitation was the first visible sign that not everything was as simple as my husband believed. It was small, easily overlooked, but it was there. A professional instinct flickering beneath the surface, quickly suppressed. The woman beside him leaned in and whispered something, her tone light, reassuring. He smiled and nodded, the moment passing. I kept my expression neutral. What mattered wasn't the mistake itself. It was what it revealed about the way he moved through the world. He trusted that success protected him from scrutiny. That confidence was enough to carry him through anything. He had grown accustomed to winning without resistance. And because I had spent years making sure things ran smoothly, he assumed I would continue to do so, even now. He didn't realize that my silence wasn't preserving his image anymore. It was observing it. As the hearing progressed, he spoke with increasing ease, elaborating where brevity would have been wiser. Each clarification revealed more than he intended. Each casual explanation rested on the belief that no one in the room was challenging him. He was right about one thing: no one was interrupting him. I had learned long ago that people reveal themselves most fully when they feel safe. When they believe the outcome is secure, they stop protecting the edges, they stop checking their footing. The crack I had noticed years earlier hadn't disappeared. It had widened, quietly, beneath layers of confidence and assumption. It didn't matter that others couldn't see it yet. It mattered that it existed. By the time the judge called for a brief pause, my husband looked entirely at ease. He stood, stretched, and spoke about lunch plans, already thinking beyond the room. The woman beside him laughed softly, her future seemingly set. I remained seated, my hands folded, my attention steady. Once you see the flaw in a story someone tells about themselves, you can never unsee it. Everything after that is context. Everything after that is confirmation. He believed this hearing would mark his victory. I knew it would mark the moment his certainty began to collapse. Not because I forced it to, but because he had built it on assumptions that couldn't withstand the weight of truth. The first crack had appeared long before we ever stood before a judge. And once I saw it, I stopped seeing him the way I used to. By the time we broke for another recess, the story about me had already settled into place. I could hear it in the softened voices around me, in the careful looks people gave as if I were fragile glass. No one asked how I was holding up. They assumed the answer. She's exhausted, she's done, she just wants this to be over. I didn't correct them. Silence has a way of inviting comfort, and comfort is what people reach for when they don't want to examine something too closely. My quiet allowed everyone in that room to believe what made the process easiest for them. It spared them the discomfort of conflict, the inconvenience of uncertainty. Across the table, my husband leaned back and stretched his arms, relaxed in a way he hadn't been in months. The tension he'd carried earlier had faded, replaced by a calm certainty. He spoke openly now, discussing timelines and next steps with casual assurance, as if my presence were incidental. The woman beside him mirrored that ease. She crossed her legs, checked her phone during pauses, and smiled at remarks that suggested the outcome was already settled. She didn't watch the judge as closely anymore. She watched him. Everyone behaved as if resistance had been removed from the equation. During a closed-door discussion, settlement terms were summarized again. Numbers were read, responsibilities outlined. I listened without interruption, nodding when acknowledgement was required. I asked no questions. I made no objections. The effect was immediate. My husband's shoulders dropped further. His lawyer shifted from caution to routine, moving through the terms with professional efficiency rather than defensive precision. The sense of urgency dissolved. When resistance disappears, vigilance follows it out the door. I could feel the shift ripple outward. Conversations grew looser. Words became less guarded. People stopped checking who might be listening. The woman beside him began to speak more freely. She referenced plans beyond the hearing, spoke about changes that would come after everything was finalized. Her tone was confident, almost celebratory, as if this were a transition rather than a reckoning. She believed I had accepted replacement. Others seemed to believe I had been compensated in some invisible way, that I had made peace with whatever I was being given. Sympathy replaced scrutiny, pity replaced caution. People offered encouragement instead of curiosity. "You've been very reasonable," someone said quietly as we passed in the hallway. I thanked them and kept walking. Even my lawyer struggled with my silence. When we were briefly alone, she asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed this way, her concern genuine, her voice careful. She worried I would regret not asserting myself more strongly, that I would look back and wish I had fought harder. I met her eyes and told her I understood her concern. I didn't explain anything else. If even she doubted me, then the illusion was complete. That was the point I hadn't expected. Being written off so thoroughly that no one thought to question it. I had spent years trying to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have my role recognized. Now, invisibility worked in my favor. No one guards information from someone they believe is irrelevant. My husband stopped lowering his voice when he spoke. He assumed I wasn't listening. He assumed I didn't understand the implications of what was being discussed. He spoke about decisions as if they were settled facts, not matters still subject to review. Each assumption made him more comfortable. Each comfort made him less careful. The hearing resumed, and with it, his confidence expanded. He answered questions with ease, offering explanations that went beyond what was asked. He elaborated where silence would have been safer. He believed clarity demonstrated control. I listened and noted the small inconsistencies, the casual phrasing, the moments where certainty replaced precision. None of it drew attention yet. None of it needed to. The woman beside him leaned closer as he spoke, nodding along, her expression one of approval. She had stopped observing the room entirely. In her mind, the outcome was already secured. That certainty was contagious. By the end of the session, the narrative about me had hardened. I was the woman who had given up, the woman who accepted what she was offered, the woman who would leave quietly and rebuild somewhere else out of sight. They believed I had nothing left to claim. As we stood to leave, my husband didn't look at me. He was already talking about schedules, about wrapping things up, about what came next. The woman beside him laughed, relief evident in the sound, her future seemingly assured. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately. I felt no urge to interrupt, no desire to correct the story forming around me. Let them have it. Let them believe it. The more convinced they became, the less they checked what truly mattered. I walked down the corridor alone, the murmur of voices fading behind me. The building felt different now, quieter, as if it had already moved past us. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm that wasn't forced. They thought I had surrendered. What they didn't understand was that surrender had never been part of the plan. What they mistook for defeat was simply restraint. What they called giving up was positioning. Every assumption they made created space. Every moment they dismissed me widened the gap between what they believed and what was real. And that gap, once it was wide enough, would swallow every certainty they were clinging to. They believed the danger had passed. In truth, it had only just begun to take shape, quietly, in the blind spot they had worked so hard to create. The paperwork moved across the table in steady stacks, each page sliding forward with a soft sound that seemed far too ordinary for decisions that would reshape lives. Sign here, initial there, a signature at the bottom, another at the top. The process had the rhythm of routine, not caution. My husband treated it that way. He skimmed quickly, pen already poised, his attention drifting between the documents and the quiet conversation he carried on with his lawyer. He signed as if the act itself were confirmation that everything had gone according to plan. To him, paperwork was a hurdle, not a warning. "Just standard language," his lawyer said at one point, tapping a paragraph without waiting for a response. My husband nodded and kept signing. This wasn't new. He had always trusted that details would resolve themselves, that someone else would catch anything worth catching. Success had trained him to believe the system worked for him automatically. Winners didn't need to read every line. Winners moved forward. The woman beside him reinforced that belief. "Let's not drag this out," she murmured once, her tone light, almost playful. "We've already been over everything." He smiled at her and turned the page. I sat quietly, my hands folded, watching the rhythm settle in. Page, pause, signature. Page, pause, signature. The repetition lulled everyone into comfort. Even the air felt relaxed, as if the outcome had already been agreed upon by consensus. There was a moment when his lawyer hesitated. It was brief, easy to miss. He slowed just slightly as he reached a section buried deeper in the stack, his fingers resting on the paper longer than before. He glanced at my husband, then back at the document, as if considering whether to say something. "What is it?" my husband asked, impatience already creeping into his voice. "Nothing," the lawyer replied after a beat. "Just making sure everything's included." My husband waved him off. "It is. We've covered this." The hesitation vanished. The page moved forward. The pen scratched against paper. I noticed exactly where that page sat in the stack. I noticed how quickly it disappeared beneath the others. I didn't speak. If I had asked a question, it would have drawn attention. If I had requested clarification, it would have slowed the process. My silence allowed momentum to do its work. Everyone in that room wanted to finish. Efficiency felt like victory. The document that mattered most looked like all the rest. No bold heading, no dramatic language. Just another attachment, another formality folded into the agreement. It blended seamlessly into the pile, treated as background rather than foundation. My husband never looked at it closely. He trusted that if something were important, someone would have told him. He trusted that winning meant safety. Confidence peaked that afternoon. He spoke openly about what would come next, about how relieved he was to be moving on. He joked about being done with courtrooms and lawyers, about getting his life back. The woman beside him leaned in, nodding, already imagining herself stepping fully into the future he described. She talked about plans with an ease that suggested certainty, not hope. Where they would live, what they would change, how quickly everything would settle once this was finalized. I listened and said nothing. No one noticed how casually they spoke about consequences they didn't yet understand. No one questioned the ease with which my husband dismissed caution. The sense of inevitability had grown too strong. When people believe they're safe, they stop checking the locks. Another stack of pages slid across the table, more signatures, more initials. The lawyer summarized terms in a voice that had shifted from protective to procedural. There was no urgency left in it. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I watched the final pages disappear beneath his pen. Everything that needed to happen had already happened. Nothing required my intervention now. The woman beside him smiled to herself, scrolling briefly through her phone as if this were an inconvenience she was humoring. She didn't look at the documents at all. She trusted him. He trusted the process. The process trusted signatures. When it was over, my husband leaned back and exhaled, satisfied. "That's it," he said. "Finally." Finally, he believed, meant freedom. He didn't see the way his lawyer gathered the papers more carefully this time, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter. He didn't notice the extra glance at the file before it was closed. Those details didn't register because he was already past the moment. I wasn't. I watched the folder snap shut and felt the weight of inevitability settle into place. What they assumed was safe had never been examined. What they rushed past would not rush past them. As we stood to leave, my husband spoke about dinner plans, about celebrating the end of something unpleasant. The woman beside him laughed, her relief unmistakable, her certainty complete. I walked with them out of the room, my expression neutral, my steps unhurried. No one suspected anything. There was nothing to suspect. On the surface, everything had gone exactly as expected. That was the danger. They believed every risk had been removed because they believed every risk had been identified. They trusted the summary without reading the structure. They trusted momentum to carry them forward. What they didn't understand was that the most powerful consequences are often hidden inside what people rush past, disguised as routine, buried in attachments no one thinks to question. They thought they were finished. I knew we were only approaching the moment when certainty would finally be tested, not by argument or accusation, but by the quiet weight of what they had agreed to without looking. And once that weight began to shift, there would be no way to put it back where it was. The night before the hearing arrived without ceremony, slipping into my apartment like a held breath. Everything that needed to be signed had been signed. Everything that needed to be filed had been filed. There was nothing left to prepare, which made the quiet feel heavier than panic ever could. I sat at the small table near the window, the city lights blinking on one by one as evening settled in. My phone rested face down beside my hand. I wasn't waiting for it to ring, but part of me knew it would. When it did, the sound felt distant, almost polite. His message was brief, the tone carefully neutral. He thanked me for being cooperative. Said he appreciated that I hadn't made things harder than they needed to be. He wrote as if we were closing a business arrangement, not dismantling a marriage, as if my silence had been a courtesy he had earned. I read it once and set the phone back down without replying. There was nothing left to say to him. Anything I could have written would have been interpreted through the same lens he'd always used, filtered into something that reassured him. Silence, at least, remained honest. Somewhere across town, I knew the woman beside him was celebrating early. I didn't need to see it to imagine it. Her confidence had grown louder in recent days, less careful, more public. She had stopped waiting for permission entirely, speaking about the future as if it were already guaranteed. She believed she understood how this would end. I stood and moved through the apartment, noticing how sparse it felt. Most of what mattered had already been removed, boxed up, or let go. The space reflected where I was now, pared down, intentional, free of noise. On the counter, a single folder sat neatly stacked, untouched. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Everything inside had already done its work. For the first time since this process began, doubt crept in quietly, not about the outcome, but about the cost. I wondered how many people would misunderstand what I'd done. How many would assume I'd been passive or lucky or cruel. I wondered whether I would always be seen as the woman who said nothing. The thought lingered, then passed. Understanding has never been guaranteed. I had spent too many years trying to earn it from people who benefited from withholding it. Tomorrow wasn't about how I would be perceived. It was about what had already been set in motion. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the building settling for the night. There was no frantic review of details, no last-minute rehearsal of arguments. Waiting was no longer passive. Waiting was simply the final step. Another message appeared on my phone, this one not from him. A mutual acquaintance wished me luck, their words carefully chosen, their assumption clear. They believed I was bracing for impact. I thanked them and turned the device off. Outside, traffic softened, the city easing into sleep. Inside, I felt an unexpected calm take hold. Not relief, not triumph. Something steadier, something earned. There was no way to stop what would happen in the morning, no last-minute intervention, no clever maneuver that could undo what had already been agreed to. The process was sealed now, carried forward by rules that didn't care about confidence or appearances. That was the point. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, tracing faint shadows as they shifted with passing headlights. My mind replayed moments from the past few months, not with regret, but with clarity. Each choice made deliberately, each silence chosen carefully, each assumption allowed to grow unchecked. They had mistaken patience for weakness, restraint for fear, quiet for emptiness. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and untroubled. I woke before the alarm, the room washed in early morning light. The day felt ordinary, which was somehow fitting. There was no dramatic weight pressing down, no sense of impending chaos. I dressed simply and moved through my routine with measured ease. Coffee brewed, shoes laced, keys collected. Each action felt final in a way that was almost comforting. As I stepped outside, the air was cool and clean, the city beginning another day unaware of what it would witness. This was the last quiet moment they would have, the last time certainty would belong entirely to them. By the time morning fully arrived, silence would no longer mean absence. It would mean consequence. I closed the door behind me and walked toward the courthouse, unhurried, carrying nothing but the knowledge that, once the day began, no one would be able to pretend this had ever been just paperwork. Morning settled into the courtroom, with a weight that felt heavier than the day before. The doors closed with a muted thud, sealing us inside a space that had no interest in anyone's confidence or fear. It smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the air still and expectant. I took my seat without hurry. My hands rested on the table, steady, my posture unremarkable. There was nothing left to prepare for. Everything that mattered had already been placed where it belonged. My husband arrived moments later, his stride relaxed, his expression composed. He glanced around the room as if confirming that nothing had changed overnight, that the world was still arranged in his favor. When his eyes passed over me, they didn't linger. I was a formality, not a variable. The woman beside him followed closely, dressed carefully, her confidence intact. She leaned toward him as they sat, whispering something that made him smile. The ease between them was unmistakable, built on the shared belief that this was the final step before moving on. Across the aisle, the lawyers organized their files. Papers were aligned, pens uncapped, routines followed. The judge had not yet entered, but the room had already grown quiet, as if everyone sensed that something had shifted even if they couldn't name it. When the judge took the bench, the room rose and settled again in practiced unison. She acknowledged the attorneys with a brief nod and looked down at the file in front of her. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. She wasn't performing for anyone. She began by confirming procedural details, her voice even, her words precise. Agreements had been submitted, attachments filed, timelines observed. The language was neutral, almost mundane, and it seemed to relax my husband further. He leaned back slightly, confident that this was simply the closing chapter to a story he believed he had authored. His attorney summarized the terms with ease, outlining the division as if reciting something already resolved. Assets, responsibilities, finality. My husband listened with half a smile, his attention drifting toward the end rather than the substance. The woman beside him watched me briefly, as if checking for a reaction, then turned away when she found none. Her certainty didn't require confirmation anymore. The judge listened without interruption. She didn't nod or frown. She didn't ask questions as the summary concluded. She simply returned her attention to the file, turning pages slowly, one at a time. The room waited. Seconds stretched. The quiet lengthened beyond what felt customary. I sensed the shift before I saw it, the way the atmosphere tightened, the way the easy confidence in the room hesitated, if only slightly. The judge stopped turning pages. She looked up. Not toward me, not yet. Her gaze lifted and settled directly on my husband and his counsel, steady and intent. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped, movement ceased. Even the woman beside him straightened a fraction, her smile faltering at the edges. My husband met the judge's eyes, still confident, still certain this was a routine pause. He offered a polite nod, the kind given by someone who believes they are being acknowledged before confirmation. The judge did not return it. She glanced back down at the file, then up again, her expression unchanged. "Before we proceed," she said calmly, "I want to confirm understanding." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. She asked a question, measured and precise, about the agreement as a whole, about responsibility, about what it meant to accept what had been signed. It was not accusatory, it was not dramatic, it was procedural. My husband answered quickly, his tone confident, his response practiced. He had no reason to hesitate. He had answered questions like this before. The judge listened, her gaze unwavering. Then she asked another question, this one narrower, more specific. It required more than certainty, it required accuracy. There was a pause this time. Not long enough to alarm anyone outright, but long enough for something to flicker across my husband's face. Confusion, quickly masked. He glanced briefly toward his lawyer, then back to the judge. He answered again, less fluid this time. The woman beside him shifted in her seat. She leaned closer, as if proximity could reinforce certainty. Her eyes darted between his face and the judge's, searching for reassurance. The judge nodded once, as if acknowledging the response, and returned to the file. She read silently for another moment, the room held in suspension. I watched the line of her finger as it traced a section of text, the way she paused, the way she turned a page back and forth. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not with anticipation, but with recognition. She looked up again directly at my husband. Her next question was simple. It did not raise her voice. It did not imply wrongdoing. It asked only whether he understood the implications of what had been agreed to. The room felt suddenly smaller. My husband opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He tried again, his words slower now, less assured. His lawyer shifted beside him, papers moving quietly as if searching for footing. The woman beside him stopped smiling altogether. The judge waited. She did not fill the silence. She did not rush him. She allowed the question to exist on its own, heavy and unyielding. In that stillness, something irreversible began to take shape. I felt it not as satisfaction, but as alignment. The law did not need my voice. It did not need my explanation. It needed only the truth of what had already been placed before it. When my husband finally spoke, his confidence had thinned. The certainty he carried into the room had begun to crack, not from accusation, but from clarity. The judge nodded once more, her expression unchanged, and returned her attention to the file. From this point forward, nothing in the room belonged to him anymore. Not the pace, not the direction, not the outcome. I remained silent, my gaze steady, as the authority of the room shifted fully and unmistakably. This was no longer a performance of confidence or control. This was the law doing exactly what it was meant to do. And as the judge prepared to continue, I understood that the moment they had dismissed me as nothing had led us here, to a place where silence no longer signaled absence, but consequence. The judge did not raise her voice, but the room felt as though it had tilted slightly, the balance shifting away from certainty and into scrutiny. She continued reading, not hurried, not dramatic, allowing the quiet to do the work that questions sometimes cannot. She referenced an attachment by number, her finger resting there as if to anchor the moment. The words she read aloud were neutral, almost bland, the kind that rarely draw attention. Responsibility, assumption, transfer, obligation. Each term landed softly, yet together they formed a weight my husband had not anticipated. He leaned forward now, the ease gone from his posture. His lawyer cleared his throat and interjected, offering clarification with a practiced tone that suggested confidence. The judge listened, her expression unchanged, then asked for confirmation. Not from the lawyer, from my husband. The request was simple. Did he acknowledge the terms as written? Did he understand their scope? Did he accept them in full? He answered yes quickly, the way people do when they believe agreement will move things along. But the judge did not move on. She asked him to specify what he understood those terms to mean, her gaze steady, her patience unyielding. This time he hesitated. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He glanced down at the table, then toward his lawyer, searching for the reassurance that had always been there before. His lawyer shifted, papers rustling quietly, his confidence replaced by calculation. The woman beside my husband leaned in, her whisper urgent now, no longer light. He nodded faintly and tried again, offering an explanation that sounded right without being precise. The judge listened. Then she asked another question. This one required detail. The room held its breath. My husband's voice faltered as he answered, the words coming slower, the confidence draining from them. He realized too late that certainty was no longer enough. He needed accuracy, and accuracy required understanding he did not have. The judge turned another page. She began outlining the implications, her tone instructional rather than accusatory. She explained what acceptance meant in this context, how assumption operated within agreements of this kind. She clarified calmly that taking ownership extended beyond assets, beyond surface value. It extended to everything attached. My husband's face changed as the meaning settled in. The lines around his mouth tightened. His lawyer leaned closer, murmuring something urgent, his earlier composure gone. The woman beside him sat frozen, her certainty unraveling as the words accumulated. The judge looked up again, directly at them both. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice even. "There is no ambiguity here." She explained that the agreement did exactly what it said it would do, that it transferred responsibility in full, that signatures indicated understanding, not assumption, that silence during the process did not alter the weight of what had been agreed to. My husband opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. For the first time since this began, he looked genuinely unsure of what to say. The narrative he had relied on no longer fit the facts unfolding in front of him. The judge did not ask for my input. She did not need to. She addressed his lawyer next, requesting confirmation that the terms had been reviewed prior to submission. The lawyer responded carefully, his words precise, his earlier confidence replaced by caution. Yes, the documents had been reviewed. Yes, the terms had been explained. The judge nodded. The woman beside my husband finally looked at me. Her eyes were wide now, her expression stripped of confidence. She searched my face for something, fear, panic, regret, but found none. I met her gaze briefly, then looked away. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify. The judge summarized her understanding aloud, not as a ruling yet, but as a foundation. She laid out the structure clearly, ensuring there was no confusion about what would follow. Each sentence narrowed the space for argument. Each clarification closed a door. My husband's lawyer attempted one last intervention, suggesting there may have been a misunderstanding. The judge listened, then responded with quiet finality. Misunderstanding did not negate agreement. Confidence did not replace responsibility. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. My husband's shoulders sagged slightly as the reality settled in. The outcome he had imagined had not just shifted, it had inverted. What he believed he had secured now revealed itself as something else entirely. The judge concluded this portion of the hearing with a brief statement, indicating that the court would proceed based on the terms as written and accepted. There would be no revision, no reconsideration. The agreement stood. She set the file down. The sound was soft, but it echoed. I remained still, my hands folded, my expression neutral. This was not the moment for satisfaction, it was the moment for recognition. The process had done what it was designed to do, not because I argued, but because I waited. As the judge prepared to move forward, I felt the finality of it settle into place. The illusion that had protected him for so long had collapsed under its own assumptions. He had believed silence meant absence. He was learning in real time that silence can also mean inevitability. And as the judge continued, the room adjusted to a new reality, one where certainty belonged not to those who assumed, but to those who understood exactly what had been agreed to. The room did not erupt the way people imagine moments like this do. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, no sudden chaos. Instead, there was a heavy stillness, the kind that settles when everyone realizes the ground beneath them has shifted and there is nowhere left to stand. My husband stared at the table in front of him, as if the answers might be written there, hidden between the grain of the wood and the faint scratches left by years of other people's decisions. His lawyer spoke to him in a low voice, too low for anyone else to hear, but I could see the urgency in his movements, the way his hands gestured in small, tight motions. The woman beside my husband looked lost. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her posture no longer relaxed. The confidence that had once filled the space around her was gone, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. She glanced at my husband, waiting for reassurance that didn't come. Then she looked at the judge, as if hoping this was all a misunderstanding that would correct itself. It didn't. The judge's voice was calm as she moved toward her ruling, summarizing what had already been made clear. Her words were precise, methodical, impossible to twist. Responsibility had been accepted. Terms had been acknowledged. The court would proceed accordingly. My husband's lawyer tried again, carefully this time, suggesting adjustments, clarifications, interpretations. The judge listened without interruption, then declined each suggestion with the same measured tone. There was no hostility in it, only certainty. When the ruling was delivered, it felt almost anticlimactic. Not because it lacked impact, but because it was inevitable. My husband absorbed it slowly, his expression hollowing as the meaning settled in. The image he had carried into the courtroom, the future he believed he had secured, collapsed piece by piece. The assets he thought he had claimed were inseparable from obligations he had ignored. The victory he had celebrated was, in reality, a transfer of weight he was now forced to carry alone. The woman beside him finally spoke, her voice barely audible. She asked a question, something about what this meant, about next steps. No one answered her right away. Her role in the room had changed, and she hadn't realized it yet. For the first time, my husband looked at me. Really looked at me. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, only disbelief. He searched my face as if trying to find the moment he'd missed, the conversation he'd overlooked, the warning sign he'd dismissed. He wanted an explanation, a confession, some acknowledgement that this had been deliberate. I gave him none. The judge concluded the session with a formal dismissal, her gavel striking softly but decisively. The sound echoed longer than expected, lingering in the room like a punctuation mark that couldn't be ignored. People began to move again. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped quietly against the floor. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, careful and subdued. The spectacle was over, replaced by the practical reality of consequences. My husband remained seated for a moment longer, his lawyer leaning in close, speaking urgently. The woman beside him stood and hovered uncertainly, no longer sure where she belonged. She glanced at him again, then at me, her eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. I gathered my things slowly. As I stood, I felt the weight of years lift, not all at once, but enough to notice. There was no surge of triumph, no desire to confront or explain. The outcome spoke for itself. Anything I said now would only dilute it. I walked past them without a word. In the hallway, the noise returned gradually. Footsteps, distant voices, the hum of a building returning to its routine. Outside the courtroom, life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the world hadn't just recalibrated itself around a truth long ignored. Behind me, I heard my husband call my name. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to discuss. Any conversation now would be an attempt to rewrite what had already been decided, to reclaim control where none remained. Silence, once again, was the most honest response I could give. I resumed walking. As I reached the exit, sunlight spilled through the glass doors, bright and unfiltered. I paused for a moment, taking in the warmth, the ordinary sounds of the street beyond. The day felt different now, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mine again. They had treated me as nothing, They had built their certainty on that belief. And now, standing on the other side of it all, I understood something with absolute clarity. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it lets others speak until there is nothing left to say. I stepped outside and let the doors close behind me, leaving the courtroom, the assumptions, and the version of myself they thought they understood exactly where they belonged. I didn't look back as I crossed the courthouse steps, but I felt the shift the moment the doors closed behind me. It wasn't relief, it wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and more permanent. The absence of a weight I had carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. Outside, the city moved on without ceremony. Cars passed. People laughed. Someone argued into a phone. The world hadn't paused for my ending, and that felt right. Real endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive, do their work, and leave you standing in a life that suddenly belongs to you again. I walked a few blocks before stopping, letting the noise settle around me. My phone buzzed in my bag. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. I didn't need to read the messages that would come later, full of confusion, accusation, regret. Explanations were no longer my responsibility. For years, I had tried to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I had spoken carefully, compromised endlessly, softened truths until they fit into someone else's comfort. I thought dignity meant endurance. I thought strength meant staying quiet so others could remain at ease. I was wrong about that part. Strength isn't loud, but it isn't invisible either. It's patient, it's deliberate. It knows when to speak and when to wait. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe exactly what they want, until the moment belief collides with reality. They called me nothing. They said it with confidence, with laughter, with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been questioned. They built a future on that assumption. They signed their names beneath it. All I did was step aside and let the truth carry its own weight. In the days that followed, the story spread the way these things always do. Fragmented, distorted, reshaped by whoever needed it to mean something else. Some people called me lucky, some called me cold. A few said I must have known all along, as if knowledge alone were enough to protect someone. Very few understood what it actually took to sit in a room where you're dismissed as nothing and say nothing back. Silence isn't empty, it's full of choice. I went home to a space that felt different now, not because the furniture had changed, but because the air had. I opened windows, I made coffee, I stood in the quiet and let it be mine. There was no dramatic celebration, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, in mornings that feel lighter, in conversations where you don't have to explain yourself, in the simple freedom of not being managed, minimized, or misunderstood on purpose. I thought about the woman who had sat beside him, so sure of her place. I didn't feel anger toward her, I felt recognition. She believed the story she'd been told because it served her to believe it. We all do that, in our own ways. The difference is what happens when the story falls apart. I had spent years being underestimated. It turned out to be the one advantage no one could take from me. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. Never rush to prove yourself to people who've already decided you don't matter. Let them keep their assumptions. Let them underestimate your patience, your intelligence, your resolve. Sometimes the most devastating form of justice isn't revenge, it's consequence. And sometimes the strongest response to being treated as nothing is to let the truth speak when you no longer need to. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or underestimated by the people who were supposed to stand beside you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and the moments when the tables finally turn, stay with me. Subscribe, and let's keep telling the stories that remind us who we really are.